This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Stick around to the end of the video for a special deal that they're offering through my channel. And now, on with the show. The Surge 2 is the sequel to the somewhat lukewarmly received The Surge, developed by Deck 13, who previously put out their equally lukewarmly received Lords of the Fallen. The Surge 2 is a game I was excited to see announced because of how much I enjoyed the first one. When I reviewed it some 2 years ago, I said this: "The result is a game that I enjoyed as a Souls-like fan, and as a fan of the setting, but not one that I can honestly recommend to a lot of players, especially those that are new to the Souls genre. I think that this just isn't showing the best that the genre has to offer. But I really believe that it could in future. As I said earlier, I really hope that there is a sequel to this game someday." For those of you that didn't play The Surge, it was a Souls-like back when we were still figuring out that Souls-like was in fact an emerging genre and not just everyone ripping off Dark Souls. I mean, they were, but they were also adding new stuff to the formula and changing parts of it, and there were enough of these games that a consensus grew that a new genre was being born. And I think at this point, most of us are pretty comfortable with the Souls-like label when we talk about games similar to FromSoft's classic. And to be sure, The Surge did borrow a lot from Dark Souls. It had a bonfire system, only it was medbays. You had to collect souls, only it was scrap. You dropped your scrap on death and could retrieve it if you could make it back to that spot. Beyond this, The Surge added its own twist. The setting was perhaps the most significant drawcard, trading the gothic fantasy of Dark Souls and Lords of the Fallen for something halfway between sci-fi Mass Effect and industrial Fallout. Combat was vastly different from FromSoft games, being faster and more acrobatic, with a big focus on very flashy animations. The means by which you collected loot was also different. You could target an enemy's specific body parts to weaken it, so that you could then lop off their limbs and collect the armor that they were wearing. But sadly, these components were overshadowed by some really big drawbacks. The sci-fi setting was both a blessing and a curse, because the developers stuck to it so rigidly that there was almost no environment variety at all, with every hour of the 25-hour adventure looking almost identical to each other. Same went for enemy variety, where there was about a dozen enemies recycled ad nauseum. Boss encounters were a huge letdown. There were about 5 of them, and they ranged from really dull to really infuriating, and not the good kind of infuriating we appreciate in the Souls-like formula, the bad type of infuriating where the boss design involved killing previous bosses repeatedly and the camera was a complete nightmare. So all of this created some very specific expectations in my mind when I sat down with a PC preview build of the game sent to me by the developer. I played about 3 hours of it, which was essentially the opening section of the game, culminating in the first boss. What I saw was a mix of good and not so great, but ultimately it left me feeling hopeful and optimistic about getting my hands on the full release later this year. There are some things here which are better, there's a lot that's the same, and there's some stuff that I think is looking like perhaps a step backwards. So let's dive into all of it and you can see how it's all looking. The first thing to note is that combat feels almost untouched versus the first game. If you played The Surge 1, you really remember that combat felt very fast, snappy, and responsive, and just really great. It almost feels a bit arcadey sometimes, more Darksiders than Dark Souls, owing to a lightness of movement and its flashy combat animations. Combat animations are informed by the weapon type that you're using, and they're all vastly different from one another. The lance-style thrust, and the heavy two-handed overhead swings, and the slashing cuts of the one-hander sword, and the slower, more labored swings of a heavier one-handed sword, and the dual-wield pincers. There's a lot of variety here, and each weapon set feels really good to settle into. I couldn't see anything new versus the first game here, but it's possible that that diversity will come later on, so we'll have to see. Combos are a big thing in this game, and I definitely saw some new ones in the mix. Combining your horizontal and vertical attacks in different ways can produce some really impressive combos, and mastering the timings of those is critical given that these attack patterns do leave you exposed when you're sort of animation locked within them. So absolutely, combat was one of the best parts of The Surge 1, and the main reason I really enjoyed it, and from what I can tell so far, this is just more Surge, which is good because you don't fix what isn't broken. The Surge 2 retains the awesome RPG and gearing systems that underpin the first game. You collect your gear by lopping it off your enemies, and you need to choose between targeting those armored pieces or going for the more vulnerable unarmored sections for quicker kills. You'll level up your rig, chassis, body armor thing to increase your power consumption capacity, allowing you to equip both higher level gear and heavier gear for more armor and more stats. Gear has set bonuses as well, so collecting complete sets yields lots of benefits, and there's also an implant system allowing you to upgrade specific combat abilities or stats. Overall, this is looking looking super solid once again, and I look forward to collecting all of the gear and sets and weapons, since the design of these was definitely a big draw card for me as I played through the first game. Having said that, all of this looks pretty much identical to the last game, so again, it's just more Surge. One of the new additions is a character creator. There's a fair number of options here, including the choice of a backstory, though it doesn't appear to influence your character in any way. It seems to just kind of be like a role-playing thing. You don't actually speak in cutscenes this time around, where you did in the previous game, so clearly the developers are trying to make the character more you this time around, with the character creator and the non-voice protagonist, etc. I don't know, that stuff doesn't really affect me that much. I don't really cling to that, but I know that is important to a lot of players. What I think has changed quite considerably this time around is the tone of the game's storytelling and the budget that I think has been put into that storytelling. The Surge 1 had this really awesome opening cinematic and this very atmospheric introduction where you were this dude in a wheelchair and you saw this like rig get bolted onto your body spectacularly.
Initiating surgery.
This time around, you sort of just like step into a med bay and then boom, you're all rigged up. Like this is exactly what it looks like to become the rigged dude.
Welcome, Officer Johnson. Rig installation in progress. Rig installation complete.
It's kind of a big thing to get your rig, and to have it sort of skipped over so unceremoniously is disappointing. This is kind of what I'm talking about when I say it feels like there's been less budget invested in the storytelling side of things. But it's more than that. It just feels like the writing and voice acting, it just feels like a step backwards. Look, I don't want to judge it too early on, but the Surge 1 had a dark, broody feel, and it wasn't holding everything back like Dark Souls does, but it did have an air of mystery about it that I think complemented the setting of a big, secretive, evil conglomerate at the center of all things. This time around, it's just sort of exposition dumps as soon as you step out the door, and there's this whole like religious cult thing with the children of Eli or something, and they worship the spark. I don't know, it just feels really ham-fisted and kind of cringy. As I said, I don't want to judge it too hard because this is a preview, but this whole thing really slaps you very hard across the face, and there are some very lengthy dialogue chunks to sit through as well, and I wasn't really loving them.
There's a fire burning in your eyes, Acolyte. I haven't seen anything like it in a long time. The city is dying. The court is our last safe haven. Join my brethren and take back control. It's now or never.
What I was loving was the Surge Rabbit Warren-like design. This is retained from the first game, where environments were smaller, but they folded back in on themselves very frequently, with way more shortcuts and hidden stuff than you might expect when you first stepped into a new area. I unlocked at least 3 shortcuts to each medbay I found, and that was just in the opening section of the game, so this exploration component looks to be just as strong this time around. It's unclear yet whether the Surge 2 will solve the first game's problems with environments being extremely repetitive. If they're gonna solve that, the first section of the game wasn't the best showcase, as it was very similar to the first game's environments. You start in a prison before making your way to a city, which seems to serve as a sort of overworld hub leading to smaller areas, and while certain parts of it look different than what we've seen before, there's certainly an air of familiarity to it. I don't know where this is going to go, because environment variety was absolutely the Achilles heel of the first game, so I'll be pretty bummed if they don't fix it this time around. I have seen some footage of some other areas in other trailers and previews and stuff though, so that's cool. Still, look, overall, this first space I explored, I like this space, and if there are 4 or 5 other spaces that are as well designed as this one, but in a different setting, I'll be a very happy camper. I hope they deliver on that. Boss time. Okay, here's the boss. First thing, I think this guy looks pretty cool. Most of the bosses in the first game did not look cool and were pretty phoned in affairs. This one, at least, looks pretty spectacular, especially considering that he's the first boss and we can only expect things to get crazier after that. It was also quite a well-designed encounter, where I had to take out each of its legs to weaken him, and then I could more easily attack the cooling tanks under his chassis, and he would spew out poison gas if I tried to just camp underneath him. It was really good. They clearly tested this encounter to see how players could cheese it, and then they plugged those gaps to make it overall really challenging, really fair, really good design. But my God in heaven, the camera in this fight, oh my God. I cannot begin to tell you how bad it was. Imagine like watching Spider-Man fight Doc Ock. If the camera was locked on one of Doc Ock's tentacles and it would move with it whenever that tentacle moved. That was what it was like to fight this boss. The camera was beyond ridiculous and there were so many just laughable moments where I just had to put down the controller and shake my head. But look, in the end, I tamed the camera by playing in a very specific way, and after that I could kill the boss very easily. I really hope this is the only boss with these sorts of camera issues, which it might be given the nature of this sort of enemy and the way they've designed it. But this was a big problem in the Surge 1 as well on a few of the boss encounters, so I'm definitely a little bit nervous here. Performance-wise, the game ran beautifully on my RTX 2080 Ti, but frankly, I'd be worried if it didn't. It's a very basic looking game in most regards, particularly when it comes to character models. I will say that the number of PC options was very impressive, giving me control over a whole bunch of stuff that I never would have expected to see in a title like this. I think PC gamers are going to be very impressed that this is not just a lazy console port, but they've put a considerable amount of time and effort into a proper PC build with real PC customization options. So if you stand back and listen to this preview, I've pretty much just praised the things that were already good about the Surge 1, and I flagged some issues about potential steps back in narrative and presentation. I'm looking forward to the Surge 2. I really enjoyed the first one despite it clearly being a 7 or 7.5 out of 10 experience. I loved the setting, even though it was repetitive. I loved the weapons and armor, I loved the combat, and I loved the RPG side of things. It just had enough elements to carry things over the line for me, which to be fair isn't super difficult given that I'm actually a huge fan of the Souls formula and it doesn't take a huge amount to please me. The Surge 2 looks like more Surge. If you didn't like the first one, I don't think this one is going to change your mind. If you haven't played the first one and you're interested in it, I really recommend going to pick up the first one since you could probably find it quite cheap. And if you've already played the Surge and you're keen for more of it, then at the very least, this looks like it will scratch that itch. I'm hopeful the game can take steps to address the issues of the first game, since I really think this franchise has a future, but we'll have to see come release day. Thank you for watching the video, and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring it. If you haven't heard of Squarespace, they make custom websites, or that's not true, you make the website. They provide the tools. They provide a really easy user interface for you to utilize if you want to build your website for your business or your blog or personal interest or your clan in certain games or whatever you want to do, man. You can build a website really easily with Squarespace for that. It's literally drag and drop a lot of the time. It does not require any expertise to be able to figure out how to use it. Even I could figure out how to use the basics of it within like the first 2 or 3 minutes. So click the link in the description below and you get 10% off your first purchase with them. And that's it. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.